Hello and welcome to Lazy Reviews. My name is Arvid, and yesterday I made a very long video where I reviewed the entire Scream franchise, not including the sixth film in the series which is about to be released. But I realized that the review was full of spoilers and also, very long, so I decided to make this review. In addition, if you wanted a more brief, spoiler-free review where I don't go in and talk about every single plot detail. And I would like to start off by introducing the film and the franchise before actually talking about the individual movies, because this is a very curious creation. So it was made by Wes Craven, who is quite famous, or he's responsible for multiple good horror movies and horror franchises, such as creating The Hills Have Eyes and The First Nightmare on Elm Street, both of which I should probably talk about sometime. And then he decided to make the first Scream movie. And I think it's curious to see a director going back and commenting on all the movies he inspired. He was a part of a movement, but also helped inspire this direction in horror movies that would define the late 70s and 80s. Not so much the slasher genre itself, but his movies did often appeal to the same audience as the slasher audience. So the slasher genre was quite dominant for horror movie goers and teenagers and everything in the late 70s and 80s. But as a genre, it had died out by the 90s. It had become cliche, it had become boring. New horror movies were more inspiring, so creature features, more psychological horrors, more different kinds of scares. A lot of different things were taking off, and the slasher genre had become just left behind, become something people looked down on, something that was just full of tropes and boring cliches, just people getting killed for no real reason other than the joy of seeing them killed with very boring, not really fleshed out characters. The 90s really was a quite different period in terms of movies than the 80s was, and was a big departure from it. And there are many reasons for this. I'm not going to go into all of them, but there was that period between the end of the Cold War and 9/11. There was a lot of soul searching in terms of finding a new purpose for society, for the individuals. You get all these office movies. You get Seven. You get Falling Down. All of this about reevaluating yourself and finding new purpose. And okay, I should just stop here because this could be an hour just talking about that. And this kind of falls into that because the slasher franchise really didn't fall into this new era. It really didn't belong. But then Wes Craven realized that, okay, this is a new time. The 90s were really full of parody. It was full of spoof. It was full of you looking back and kind of ridiculing the past, but also embracing parts of it. So this old director, at that point, Wes Craven was actually not that young. I think he was in the late 50s or 60s when he made the first film. And he goes in and creates a love letter and a big joke or ridicule of the slasher genre, of older horror movies. He's definitely not the first one to do this. We do have, for example, Young Frankenstein by Mel Brooks, which parodies the Universal and Hammer horror movies, and now Wes Craven goes back and does the same with the horror movies of the late 70s and 80s. But having been a part of making those movies himself, there is this love letter to them as well. So it's not really just saying they're stupid, but also embracing the stupidity of them and trying to transform this into something more palatable for the modern audience. Meaning that he does make the Ghostface Killer is one of the most basic, cheap, plain-looking villains you have in any horror movie. I mean, it's just this black hooded figure with this really simple mask. But the thing is, in its simplicity, even boring simplicity, he created such an iconic figure that he did end up launching this franchise. People really love this Ghostface Killer. I remember when I was a kid, a lot of people wanted that outfit. Don't think a lot of kids even knew where it came from, but people really loved the outfit. They wanted to dress up like it. I remember a lot of other outfits you could buy for Halloween or whatever. They mimicked the Ghostface Killer. It became such a big phenomenon for that. This whole Scream idea and again, it also played really into this irony of the 90s that you should never take anything too seriously. not only did it do that, but then it ended up being spoofed itself in the Scary Movie franchise, which also is really stupid that you have a horror comedy that becomes so iconic that it itself becomes satirized and parodied. So it's just so meta, the whole thing. And I think that's kind of the beauty of it on paper, that it's created by the old veterans of horror movies that try to go back and reevaluate with modern eyes, while also trying to create something new. However, it might work better on paper than it does in real life. I think probably said enough already. I think I can start talking about the movies themselves. So the first Scream came out in 1996, and I will definitely not go into spoiler territory. There are a few things I will have to spoil just because it is a franchise and every movie is a sequel to each other. There are no prequels or whatever, so some people will survive, some people won't, and I will try not to spoil it, but some things will probably have to be mentioned. If you do want to hear everything I had to say about this franchise, you should listen or watch my longer review of this. So this is from 1996. It stars Neve Campbell as the lead as Sidney Prescott. I really love this actress. I don't know. She was very popular in the 90s, and then kind of faded out. I don't know where she is today. I hope she's doing well and that it was her decision to quit Hollywood, that she didn't just, get too old and was discarded for that reason. And what it also does, this movie, is that it really has a splendid cast of one-dimensional, stereotypical characters. Kind of, if you take all the teenage drama movies and comedies and stuff like Beverly Hills 90210 or whatever it's called, and take characters from that and make them even more one-dimensional and stereotypical and very 90s, and then kind of say overact, do just be wild, be crazy, make a role memorable. So you have these very boring, flat characters with a lot of them acting their ass off. And I think the best example of this is Matthew Lillard. He's just, again, another actor who was very big in the 90s, kind of faded away as well. We rarely see him anymore, but he's so good in this film. He is, if there is a real reason to watch this movie, it's pretty much his character. He's so amazing. Anyway, so yeah, it has this very weird, the lighting, the cinematography, everything about it is quite decent, but also very standard of its time. The colors, the lighting, everything looks so much like a rom-com, a teenage drama, all these. It's just one big cliche. The whole movie is one big cliche, and it's very difficult to know when it's doing it to parody the tropes of the time and of the past, and when it's just a product of this time and not really self-aware. It's very difficult to know where one ends and the other begins with this. So I guess I'll mostly give it the benefit of the doubt, because this movie is it's a pleasing movie to watch, but also a very boring movie to watch, and it might be intentional. And the film starts with this very iconic scene that is replicated in all but one of the other movies. And this girl gets a call having this stranger ask her what is her favorite scary movie. Do you like scary movies? What is your favorite scary movie? That kind of became a phrase used in all the movies, and I do believe it's also made it into pop culture to some extent, not in a way where people remember it anymore, apparently. At least I don't. And of course, she gets killed off by this ghost face killer. We do see the killer right away, and then the rest of the film is about the class. So our main characters were in the same class as the two people getting killed in the beginning, a girl and her boyfriend. And it's about how society reacts to these things. Actually quite common thing for horror movies. But what this does is also comments on horror movie audiences, that nobody really takes these murders seriously. Everybody's actually kind of thinking it's a bit fun and playing around it. So it's, I think, commenting on how the modern youth, or the youth of the 90s, had become so detached from the horrors and violence of reality that even when it happened next to them, they can't really deal with it properly anymore. It's still surreal, it's still a game to them. And that's pretty much, actually, that's something that really repeats in this movie, the other movies, that death is not really taken seriously. It's playful, it's a game, it's almost non-consequential, that there are no consequences to anything. Again, everybody has this ironic, distant stance towards the things that go on around them. And I do believe that it is a comment on the horror movie audience and society as a whole, and not just because this movie is weird in this way. bad, someone might say. It also comments on how the media portrays these things, as one of the lead characters, Gail Winters, is investigating these crimes. Also, so Prescott's mom apparently died about a year ago, and a man has been arrested for the murder and in prison for a year, but evidence is fairly circumstantial. So the reporter gets involved, not just to dive into these new murders, but also she tries to prove the innocence of the man possibly wrongly arrested for the murder, not to help him, but to help further her career. She's really focused on her career, and her character only changes, I think, in the third or fourth movie, where she becomes more of a loving person. Until then, she's very selfish. She undergoes very little character development, even when you think she does. And I think it's just a comment on the press, and how the press often is self-obsessed with their own career, and really not concerned with the victims, because Prescott gets attacked, survives, and then she's getting swarmed by all these journalists led by Gail Winters. She's one of them. And she's kind of harassed by them, and they don't really respect the humanity. So that's also an element of it. And another of our main characters is this deputy, who is the brother of one of the friends, one of the victims, eventual victims, and also a friend of Prescott, and he helps in this investigation. And I should also note that this is a lot about this movie really plays on whodunit. You kept guessing that you know that the murderer is among the people you see on screen, but you don't know who did it. And very quickly, Prescott's boyfriend gets arrested because she suspects him of being the one who attacked her, and he's released. And it's about reconnecting after traumatic events happen, but can you still trust each other? And this is again something that's true for all the movies, and it's something that quite separates it from the traditional slashers, where you're almost always certain who the murderer is. Not always in the first one. I think one example of one where you don't know who the murderer is Sleepaway Camp. But usually you know that the murderer is not one of the people you are following. In this one, it's the complete opposite. So this is one where it kind of renews the slasher genre in a way that works quite well. And the final character I should mention, I think his surname is Miller. He is the meta guy, the real meta guy of the film, the one who's a horror movie fan, who knows all about horror movies and keeps talking about horror movies. And there are some quite iconic scenes with him, where there is this party at the end of the film where they're watching the first Halloween movie, and he pauses the movie, starts talking about how you survive horror movies, how there are different rules. So, for example, if you're a virgin, you will survive. If you have sex, you die. If you drink or do drugs, you die. And there's another scene with him that's also quite iconic, where he's watching Halloween and talking about, oh, look behind you, like pretending he's the audience watching this film, talking to the characters, like you can communicate on how stupid they are, how always... This movie plays a lot on all the cliches, and that they're always stupid in horror movies, that they also always trip and fall and have all these fake outs and everything while also doing it, which again kind of works on paper. But the problem is that it's because while he's saying this, we see that someone is sneaking up behind him. So we start yelling at him, look behind you, look behind you. And this is even parodied in one of the later movies, where someone is watching another one saying, well, look behind you, and someone is sneaking up on that one. So the problem really with this movie, the franchise in general, but especially this movie, it is too meta. I really didn't enjoy how you constantly have references to other movies, references to actors, references to movie characters, even that these people don't have normal conversations. People don't talk like they do in this film. And I know that it's intentional, because this is a movie. And it's a very self-aware movie. It's one of those movies where they keep saying, this is not a movie. And other characters says, if this were a movie. So you have this going on a lot. But it's too much. If it was really downplayed, I think it would be quite effective. But the way it's done is just way too much. It's too much in your face. And it's very 90s in that meta-ironic they don't take anything seriously. And that's actually what really hurts this movie. Because in the end, this is not a good movie. It's a very mediocre movie. And I can say that you might enjoy it if you want to understand the 90s better. because this is the embodiment of the 90s. People dress like it's the 90s. People talk like it's a movie from the 90s. It looks like a movie from the 90s. It embodies the humor and the social, not social discourse, but the discussions going around in society. It it's an embodiment of the 90s. So in that way, it is interesting for me. But as a horror movie, it doesn't really work that well. It has some good scenes. It has, as I said, the Ghostface killer kind of works in the who is the killer aspect. It has a few good scenes. The ending is quite good. But in the end, I will only say that I could give it a low recommendation as a movie. If you're not really interested in the 90s, whatever, I can only just the enjoyment you might get from this movie and its performances. And most of it is because of Matthew Lillard, because he really chews the scenery and it's amazing. Everything else about this is so mediocre that maybe watch it, but I'm not sure you should. I guess because I don't want to spoil, I should just move on to the next film. So Scream 2 came out the year after, in 1997, and is again made by Wes Craven. And actually, Wes Craven would make the first 4 Scream movies, and it would also, the Scream 4 would be the last movie he made, which is a bit tragic, I would say. He died in 2014. And that's also why the themes are quite consistent, why they kind of work as sequels, and they also have, mostly I would say until the 4th movie, they also have a very similar look to them, a similar feel, the cinematography, the sound design, everything. Even they use Nick Cave a lot in the movies, and that there's one song that just keeps being repeated in a movie. And I do like, that is something I do like about a lot of horror movies, because they have all these different people involved. The movies don't really feel like they belong in the same universe. But if I can say one thing that I do like about it, it's the consistency in the first 3, even first 4 movies. Even if, as I said, it's actually cinematography, sound design, everything is quite boring. Not bad, just very mediocre, very by the numbers, run of the mill, really. And I would also want to say that for a sequel, the idea for this sequel is actually really good. It continues being very meta. It continues commenting on the discussions, the debates of the time, while also commenting on horror movie sequels and how society reacts to real life events, what I already talked about. Because in this one, the events of the first movie has been turned into a new movie, or turned into a film in the film's universe called Stab. So suddenly Prescott gets calls from people saying, "Do you like scary movies?" Pretending, because they've seen the film and they get her number, and she just gets used to it, and she's not really. She tries to cope with the trauma she experienced, while everybody doesn't really care about the fact that she went through these horrible experiences, that people died. To everybody, it's just fun and games, which is really just, again, that's what people were talking about. This there's this discussion in the movie: does movie cause violence, or a movie's not responsible for the violence caused by people who watch them? And that was a big discourse at the time. It's the same with video games and violence. You had the Columbine. You had so many things in the 90s that talked about this. You even had the German movie called Funny Games that came out the same year. So this is what was really talked about in the 90s. The 80s was full of the satanic panic and everything. The 90s was about how society influences the decisions of the individuals through media, or more so how parents and religious groups were paranoid that horror movies and games caused people to do violent things. And that's what this movie really talks about. But of course, Miller is back talking about how sequels, the rules for sequels that are different, slasher sequels, whatever, that horror movie sequels always have different rules than the first film. You have, again, the murders reoccur because someone is imitating the Stab movies, imitating real events, but doing it because they watched Stab. You have Gail Weathers, I think her name is back again, still trying to further her career. We have the detective, or the deputy, back again. We have a new cast of very pretty face, boring, flat characters. And this is, again, small spoiler. So it turns out that the man who was arrested for the murder of her mother was the wrong guy. And he comes back, he tries to get his life back in order after being in jail for 1 year, but he is a creepy guy. He's a bit of an asshole, and he also only cares about fame. It's something that, again, actually is true for all of these movies in one way or another. It's that people just want to be famous. People don't really care how they reach fame. They just want to be famous. So they can be famous by being the victim. They can be famous by being the perpetrator. They can be famous by this or that. And all of the movies touch on this in one way or another. Again, social commentary on how, with reality TV, with all these developments that started in the 90s and really took off after social media, how the individual pursuit is success through exposure of any kind. There's even a quote in a later movie that these days you don't need to go to law school or get a degree or start your own business to be famous. All you need is just to put things online, be seen on Twitter, be seen on YouTube, on Facebook, and that's how you become famous. So that's a theme for running through all of these movies. And this one also comments on racial stereotypes, racism in horror movies, especially how the African Americans are underrepresented in horror movies. If they are included, they're usually kind of given stereotypical roles or just killed off easily. So this movie also comments on that. Later, we also get some of the other movies. We also get comments on women's roles in horror movies. So it's almost like the perpetrator, the actual actions that go on in this movie, the events that go on that occur, are just used as a background material for social commentary and for spoofing horror movies, which is also probably why this movie is not that good. It has a few very effective scenes, but overall it's worse than the first one and really not recommendable. It's not terrible. I should say all the first 5 movies, none of them are bad. They're just not good. They are mediocre at best, and many of them are slightly below mediocre, and that's why I can't recommend this movie. So let's talk about the third movie. Scream 3 came out in 2000, and this one is again a good idea for a sequel. In this one, this film is about making horror movies. So whereas the first one was about spoofing and parodying horror movies, and everything, all the events of it was just basically a parody on horror movies, but while still also commenting and being a parody and everything on the fans of horror movies and the cliches and everything. The second one had more social commentary about it. This one comments and parodies, satirizes the industry, comments on exploitation of women in the industry, how they often have to perform, or at least. So this is almost 20 years before Harvey Weinstein and everything, and the Me Too movement. But this one talks about how women were really exploited, that they often had all these big dreams but never really made it because they didn't have the right look, or they didn't want to perform sexual favors with the producers. And I do like the movie for having these themes. It also has themes about inspiring actors, older women having to play younger women because they can't get any better roles than being someone being stabbed in a film. You have the problem. This one has a lot of sexism involved in it. It takes place at this movie set because now they are making Stab 2, so the sequel to the first Stab movie, and the deputy of the first 2 movies is now involved as the screenwriter for this one, and the cast starts getting killed off. Prescott is also trying to deal with the trauma, so she now has a self-help hotline, one of those where people can call in asking her for advice, and she will help them get through their problems. So she lives secluded life. She's not easy to track, so the Ghostface Killer tries to track her down, and he ends up killing some people to try and track her down. And the movie will let you know later why all of this happened, but I'm not gonna spoil it here. But yes, it's mostly about the industry, Hollywood, and it still does have its parodies and cliches and plays with all the tropes of horror movies. One trope I forgot to mention is used in all of these films is that the killer never dies when you think the killer is dead. He or she always comes back. And the movie does do that over and over in each movie, but every time it does it, it has a new take on it. And that's what I will say that I do like about these movies. They are not lazy. All of them tries to do something different. They try to expand on the universe. They try to comment on new things. They try to make new jokes. They try to include new things. And even when they do redo things, because they are still embodiments, meaning that they do have to tread the same tropes. They do have to repeat the same things that happened in the old movies. They do have to do all the cliches, but they always try to do them differently. So even though I don't really like them, I do think a lot of thought went into them. These movies work much better on paper than they do the way they're actually executed. And I think I don't need to talk more about this one. It's probably slightly less interesting than the second one. So yeah, I don't really see a reason why to watch it. Scream 4. So it took 11 years for Wes Craven to return to make Scream 4, the last movie of his career. And it makes sense that it took him so long because so the third one, they also play on the tropes of having a trilogy and all the rules that the final movie in a trilogy should have. That different parts of a franchise have different rules applied to them. So this one is the reboot. So this one goes by reboot rules. And a lot has happened since the other movie. So this one talks more about social media. It talks more about now that torture porn and those things are now more famous. Nobody really cares about the old slasher things anymore. So that also means that the violence in this movie is actually more violent. It's more grisly. I would say that the violence is actually, we do have a few really good violent scenes in it. And I would also say that one thing I forgot to mention is the Ghostface killer is actually not a bad villain. He does always stab his victims. Sometimes there's a pistol involved, but usually he stabs his victims, which is a bit boring compared to the other slasher villains. But being, a masked killer, and you always know it's a human behind it, it's not something supernatural, so you know it's a new person in each film. Well, maybe that's spoiler, but it is a new person in each film. It also helps create some consistency in these movies and do link them together, meaning you do have certain expectations as you should from a franchise, but it also allows for some flexibility, which I do like. I do like that concept. I think it's actually a good concept for a killer. Even, as I said, the killer is quite boring, really. But even boring in an iconic way, the look is cool, yet simple. So Wes Craven was quite genius with this. I don't know if he was the one who came up with the outfit, but I do think that actually that's very well pulled off. That with such an outfit, you not only parody the slasher villain, you create something new and iconic. So yes, this is a reboot in the sense that we have a new cast of characters that become the new leads, and Prescott and Weathers and the detective take more of a smaller part in it, allowing the new characters to flourish, but also still have very active roles in furthering the plot. And not exactly passing the torch, but almost. It's almost a passing the torch thing. In many ways, it's probably the worst one in the franchise. It was the most boring one. I really didn't like where it went most of the time. It was really difficult for me to stay interested and engaged in the movie. It does have some effective kills, and it does have some some characters you care about, but not really. Actually, pretty much, aside from maybe Prescott, I didn't care about anyone. Well, Prescott and the detective, I didn't really care about anyone in this movie. It felt so boring. It just didn't like it at all, and I think it's so sad that it was Wes Craven's last movie. But I should end it here and talk about the fifth one, because talking about the cliches, talking about the tropes, talking about passing the torch, the fifth one from 2022, I think, is what they call a requel. So that is about passing the torch. I think this movie was made in response to the new trend that we are still going through. Maybe it is dying down slowly, but I don't really see evidence that it is. And that's, going back and taking old intellectual properties, taking old ideas, taking things with existing fandom and remaking it, rebooting it. You have it with Ghostbusters, you have it with Star Wars, you have it with Indiana Jones, you have it with all these things that people have a lot of feelings about. It doesn't talk that much about fandom, but it does talk about how it can be difficult to actually make a new movie because you will only end up pissing off the original audience. And these movies also tend not to care about the original audience, that this is all about creating something new while mocking the old, which I think is actually true to some extent. I think if there's one thing that's true for the requels I've seen, is that they don't care too much about the original audience. They don't care too much about the original movies. They think they can do it better. They think they can do it differently. They don't care about the tropes. Don't care about the rules of the genres. They, for example, with the new Star Wars movies, they want to subvert your expectations rather than play into the fact that they are making a genre movie. They are making a space opera. So maybe you should actually not try to change everything. I do like the idea of changing some things up, but also when you do have to do with a franchise, when you do have to do with something with established tropes, established laws, all these things, maybe going in and just trying to alter everything and making a movie that might even end up being the opposite of what the original was, that will only end up causing a stir. I'm not saying that the movies can't be better or equally good, but it will inevitably make a stir. And that's what this movie is about. Prescott and Weathers have even more of a backseat in this film, but they are there to try and tell all the new protagonists about the rules. But of course, the new protagonists don't want to hear about this. In the end, it might actually end up saving them that you have these old people from the old movies that know all these things, that still play by the books of the genre, come in and save the day, that trying to just pass the torch and ignore all the rules of the other movies and create something completely new and devoid of any sparkle from the original movies. That's actually a bad idea, because that's not what ends up saving the day. I might be reading too much into this, but does seem like that's the point of this movie. That's about commenting. When you have a franchise, it's not just horror movie franchises, but with franchises, you do go in expecting some of the same. But if you only get the same, you'll also be bored and ask, why didn't they do something new? Why didn't they do something different? And this one and the previous movie, so the Scream 4 and Scream 5, do talk about how difficult it is actually to appease everyone. Because if you only make something that just copies all the tropes and cliches of the previous movies without doing anything new, you will probably make a bad movie that people won't enjoy. But if you do try to change things up too much, you will end up sometimes annoying the old fans without creating new ones, because maybe your movie is not good enough to attract new audience anyway. Or maybe the younger audience or new audience would never really have been interested in what you were making in the first place, because it placed on nostalgic value rather than, trying to create a new intellectual property. You do just play on the nostalgia and the fact that you already have an established IP. And that might mean that, might not attract as many new people, attracts the old one, but might dissuade them from watching new movies in this franchise. And that's what these movies are about, essentially. There are still also social commentary, as I said, about social media, about how everybody's just focused on fulfilling their own individual goals, on how to further their career without putting in an effort, that destructive forces can more easily lead to personal success, at least the idea that it can, than positive forces. So all the themes of these movies are actually quite good. And I would say the kills in this one is actually also good in the fifth one. I should also note one thing they also parody in the fifth one is that the fifth one is just called Scream. And that's also a parody on how in the last 10 years, when there have been these requels, reboots, they often discard the title, the number from the title, even though they're often direct sequels. And I was mad at first, but then I realized it was actually a joke. I was intended to dislike this because the movie does have a scene where YouTube reviewers are discussing the new Stab movie, that's Stab 8, but it's just called Stab without the number. And they're saying, how stupid is this? They should just call it Stab 8. These titles are just confusing and bad. So this movie did this on purpose, and I will applaud it for that. Will I applaud it for anything else? Yeah, well, I already applauded it for the themes and some of the kills, but no, it's not a good movie. It's still a boring movie. Don't really see a reason why I should watch it. So, I talked about all the first 5 movies. The 6th one will soon come out. I will probably also talk about this. A quick summary. The first one might be worth watching if you're interested in the 90s, and also kind of works well for because of its acting. It doesn't really have much else going on for it. If you are into slasher movies because of the kills, it has really boring kills, so there's no reason to watch it for that reason. The next 4 movies are all boring. They do have interesting themes, they do have interesting commentary. Some of them have at least a few scenes that work, but I don't really see why you should watch them. I can't recommend them, actually. I should end it here. If you want to read my written reviews about these movies, some of them are detailed, some of them are not very detailed. You can check my profile on Letterboxd, The Robot Quits. There will be a link to it in the description. And that's it. I will end it here. Have a nice day.